Behind the classic Western facade of Rio Bravo lies a treasure trove of bizarre production secrets, from birthday pranks involving 300 pounds of manure to Quentin Tarantino's unusual dating strategy. The film's sets were built at an odd scale, actors disappeared from scenes, and the movie served as both a political statement and inspiration for spaghetti westerns. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about Rio Bravo. Fact 1. The birthday manure gift. When Ricky Nelson celebrated his 18th birthday on May 8, 1958, he probably expected the usual cake and presents from his famous co-stars. Instead, what he got was one of Hollywood's most memorable and messy practical jokes. Just 1 week into filming Rio Bravo at Old Tucson Studios in Arizona, John Wayne and Dean Martin decided to give the young singer and actor a birthday gift he would never forget. The two veteran performers, who had taken on somewhat of a big brother role with Nelson during production, presented him with a 300-pound sack of steer manure. But the gift itself wasn't the end of the prank. Wayne and Martin then proceeded to throw the birthday boy directly into the center of the massive pile of manure, treating it as some kind of twisted Hollywood rite of passage into manhood. This wasn't just a random act of cruelty disguised as humor. In the culture of 1950s film sets, especially on westerns where masculine camaraderie was highly valued, this type of rough initiation was seen as a way of welcoming someone into the fold. Nelson, who was still a teenager and relatively new to serious acting, had been somewhat of an outsider among the more experienced cast members who had worked together on previous films. The incident became legendary on the Rio Bravo set and was later shared in interviews and behind-the-scenes stories. Rather than being offended or upset, Nelson apparently took the prank in good spirits, understanding that it meant Wayne and Martin had accepted him as one of the guys. The manure incident became a bonding moment that helped establish the easygoing chemistry between the three men that translates so well to their on-screen relationships in the finished film. This type of rough-and-tumble humor was typical of John Wayne's approach to mentoring younger actors, and it reflected the informal, family-like atmosphere that director Howard Hawks encouraged on his film sets. Fact 2. Built to miniature scale. The entire town of Rio Bravo that audiences see on screen was actually built at 7/8 scale, meaning every building, doorway, and structure was deliberately constructed smaller than normal size. This unusual decision by the production team at Old Tucson Studios created a subtle but noticeable effect that made John Wayne, Dean Martin, Ricky Nelson, and the rest of the cast appear more imposing and heroic than they would have in full-sized sets. This wasn't an accident or a cost-cutting measure, but rather a deliberate cinematic technique designed to enhance the larger-than-life personas of the Western heroes. When actors walked through doorways that were slightly too small for normal proportions, or stood next to buildings that were just a bit shorter than expected, they automatically appeared more commanding and powerful on camera. The effect was so subtle that most viewers never consciously noticed it, but it contributed to the mythic quality that made the characters seem like true legends of the Old West. The 7/8 scale construction required careful planning and precise measurements from the nearly 100 carpenters and skilled craftsmen who built the additional structures specifically for Rio Bravo. Every element had to be scaled down proportionally, from the height of the saloon doors to the width of the jail cell bars, while still maintaining the authentic look and feel of a genuine frontier town. This technique was part of a broader Hollywood tradition of using optical illusions and forced perspective to create desired visual effects long before computer-generated imagery became available. The slightly undersized buildings worked in harmony with cinematographer Russell Harlan's camera angles to create compositions that emphasized the heroic stature of the main characters. Interestingly, this scaling effect occasionally created unintended moments where the artificial nature of the set became visible, particularly in scenes where actors moved to the edges of the constructed areas, where the scale difference became more apparent to observant viewers. Fact 3. Elvis almost played Colorado. Before Ricky Nelson ever stepped foot on the Old Tucson set, director Howard Hawks had his sights set on an even bigger musical star for the role of Colorado Ryan. Elvis Presley was Hawks' first choice to play the young gunslinger, and the king of rock and roll was reportedly enthusiastic about the opportunity to work alongside John Wayne and Dean Martin in what would have been a major Western debut. Hawks specifically wanted someone who could connect with teenage audiences and draw them into theaters to see a traditional Western, and in 1958, no one had more appeal with young fans than Elvis Presley. The singer had already proven his acting ability in films like Love Me Tender and Jailhouse Rock, and the idea of pairing him with established Hollywood legends like Wayne seemed like a perfect combination of old and new entertainment styles. The negotiations appeared to be moving forward smoothly until Elvis's manager, Colonel Tom Parker, began making demands that Hawks and the Warner Brothers studio found completely unacceptable. Parker insisted that Elvis receive top billing above John Wayne, which was essentially asking for the king to be positioned as the star of the film rather than Wayne, who was not only the lead actor but also had significant influence over the production. Even more problematic was Parker's financial demands, which were far beyond what the studio was willing to pay for what was essentially a supporting role. The Colonel's reputation for driving hard bargains was well known in Hollywood, but his requirements for the Rio Bravo deal were considered excessive even by industry standards. Both Hawks and Wayne refused to budge on Parker's demands, particularly the top billing requirement, which they saw as disrespectful to Wayne's status and inconsistent with the film's structure. When the negotiations reached an impasse, Hawks moved on to other options and eventually cast Ricky Nelson, who proved to be perfect for the role and much more cooperative during the production process. Fact 4. Hawks hated his star choice. Howard Hawks made no secret of his reluctance to cast Ricky Nelson in Rio Bravo, considering the 18-year-old singer to be both too young and too lightweight for a serious Western role. Despite eventually agreeing to hire Nelson after the Elvis Presley negotiations fell through, Hawks deliberately minimized the young performer's dialogue, giving him the fewest possible lines for someone who received third billing in the film's credits. Hawks' skepticism about Nelson stemmed from his belief that the teenager was primarily a pop music sensation rather than a legitimate actor, and he worried that casting such a young performer might undermine the credibility of his Western. The director was known for his exacting standards and his preference for working with seasoned professionals who could handle complex dialogue and nuanced character development, qualities he doubted Nelson possessed. Throughout the filming process, Hawks kept Nelson's speaking parts to an absolute minimum, often relying on the young actor's natural charisma and screen presence rather than giving him substantial dramatic scenes to perform. This approach meant that Nelson's character, Colorado Ryan, communicated more through action and subtle expressions than through lengthy conversations with the other characters. However, Hawks' professional judgment proved to be somewhat short-sighted when it came to understanding Nelson's commercial value. After Rio Bravo's release and overwhelming box office success, Hawks publicly admitted that having Ricky Nelson's name on the movie poster had probably added at least $2 million to the film's total earnings, a significant sum that represented a substantial portion of the movie's overall profits. This admission revealed the tension between artistic integrity and commercial considerations that frequently exists in Hollywood filmmaking. While Hawks may have questioned Nelson's acting abilities, he could not argue with the financial results that the young star's popularity brought to the production. The director's initial resistance to Nelson ultimately gave way to grudging respect for the teenager's ability to draw audiences to theaters, even if Hawks remained convinced that his minimal dialogue approach had been the right creative decision. Fact 5. Tarantino's dating litmus test. Quentin Tarantino has turned Rio Bravo into the most unusual relationship screening tool in Hollywood history, using Howard Hawks' Western as his personal compatibility test for potential romantic partners. The acclaimed director has openly admitted that whenever he begins getting serious about a new girlfriend, he shows her Rio Bravo and expects her to appreciate it, famously stating that she better love it or there will be no future for their relationship. This unconventional dating strategy was first revealed by Tarantino during a 2007 Cannes Film Festival screening, where he introduced the film to audiences. He explained that Rio Bravo serves as his ultimate litmus test because he considers it one of the greatest films ever made and believes that anyone who cannot appreciate its brilliance simply would not be compatible with him on a fundamental level. Tarantino's obsession with Rio Bravo began when he was just 5 years old after his great-grandmother took him to see it in theaters, and the film has remained his favorite hangout movie throughout his entire career. He has described the Western as the perfect example of how characters can become so well developed that audiences feel like they are actually spending time with real friends rather than watching fictional performances. The director's approach to using movies as relationship tests might seem extreme, but it reflects his deeply held belief that shared appreciation for cinema reveals important truths about personality and values. For Tarantino, someone's reaction to Rio Bravo indicates whether they understand storytelling, character development, and the subtle artistry that goes into creating truly great entertainment. Tarantino has also mentioned that as someone who grew up without a father figure, he looked to Rio Bravo as a model for how men should behave with dignity and honor, making the film not just entertainment, but a personal guide to masculine conduct. This emotional connection to the movie explains why he considers a partner's appreciation of it to be so crucial to determining long-term compatibility. Fact 6. Paid actors who never appeared. 2 actors received full payment and screen credits for Rio Bravo despite being completely absent from the finished film, creating one of Hollywood's most unusual situations where performers were essentially paid to disappear. Harry Carey Jr. and Malcolm Atterbury both signed contracts, showed up for work, and had their names listed in the opening credits, but audiences never see either man in a single scene of the movie. Harry Carey Jr.'s removal from the film stemmed from a combination of personal problems and a serious breach of set etiquette that infuriated director Howard Hawks. Carey was struggling with alcoholism at the time, which was already creating concerns about his reliability and professionalism during the production. However, the final straw came when Carey made the mistake of addressing Hawks as simply Howard, instead of the more respectful Mr. Hawks during one of his first days on set. This casual form of address was considered a major insult by Hawks, who was known for maintaining strict hierarchical relationships on his film sets and expected to be treated with the formal respect due to his position as director. Hawks was so angered by what he perceived as Carey's disrespectful behavior that he immediately decided to remove the actor from the production entirely. Despite his fury with Carey, Hawks chose to honor the existing contract rather than engage in a legal battle or create negative publicity for the film. This meant that Carey received his full salary and retained his promised screen credit, even though every scene he had filmed was cut from the final version of the movie. Malcolm Atterbury faced a similar fate, though the specific reasons for his removal are less clearly documented. Like Carey, Atterbury was cast to play a townsperson role, received payment, and appears in the credits as Jake the stage driver, but never actually appears on screen in the completed film. This unusual situation demonstrates the complex business and personal dynamics that often occurred behind the scenes in Hollywood productions of the 1950s. Fact 7. The silent opening sequence. Rio Bravo begins with an extraordinary 4-minute sequence that contains absolutely no spoken dialogue, creating an unusual homage to the silent film era that was already 30 years in the past by the time of the movie's release in 1959. This extended opening, which includes both the opening credits and the establishment of the main conflict, relies entirely on visual storytelling and Dmitri Tiomkin's musical score to communicate essential plot information to the audience. The silent sequence introduces viewers to the central characters and sets up the entire premise of the film through carefully choreographed action and facial expressions alone. Audiences watch as Dude, played by Dean Martin, stumbles into the saloon in a disheveled state, encounters Joe Burdett's cruel coin-in-the-spittoon humiliation, and witnesses the shooting that leads to the arrest that drives the rest of the story, all without hearing a single word of dialogue. Howard Hawks deliberately chose this approach as both an artistic statement and a demonstration of his belief in the power of pure visual cinema. The director was known for his appreciation of silent film techniques and wanted to prove that modern audiences could still be engaged by storytelling that relied on images and music rather than constant verbal exposition. This technique was particularly unusual for a Western in 1959, when most films in the genre relied heavily on dialogue to establish character relationships and explain plot developments. Hawks instead trusted his actors to convey complex emotions and motivations through their physical performances and facial expressions, creating a more cinematic and less theatrical approach to the material. The silent opening also served a practical purpose by immediately establishing the tone and pacing that would characterize the rest of the film. By forcing audiences to pay close attention to visual details and subtle character interactions from the very beginning, Hawks prepared them for a movie that would prioritize character development and atmosphere over rapid-fire action and exposition. Fact 8. The cutthroat song, Connection. The ominous musical theme that plays throughout Rio Bravo, known as El Deguelo, carries a dark historical significance that connects the film to one of the most famous battles in American history. Composer Dmitri Tiomkin based this haunting melody on the actual bugle call that General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna ordered to be played repeatedly during the 1836 siege of the Alamo in San Antonio, Texas, as a psychological weapon against the defenders trapped inside the mission. In the film, Ricky Nelson's character Colorado explains the meaning of this sinister tune to John Wayne's Sheriff Chance, identifying it as the cutthroat song and describing how it was used to inform the Texan defenders that no mercy would be shown and no prisoners would be taken. The Spanish word degüello literally translates to throat cutting, and the song served as an audio death sentence that was meant to break the morale of anyone who heard it echoing across the battlefield. Tiomkin's use of this historically significant melody was not just atmospheric decoration, but a deliberate choice that connected the fictional siege in Rio Bravo to the real-life tragedy at the Alamo. The composer later reused this same theme in John Wayne's 1960 film The Alamo, creating a musical bridge between the two movies and reinforcing the historical connections. The influence of Tiomkin's El Degüello theme extended far beyond Rio Bravo and helped shape the sound of an entire genre of filmmaking. When Italian director Sergio Leone began planning A Fistful of Dollars in 1964, he specifically asked composer Ennio Morricone to write music in the style of Dmitri Tiomkin, and Morricone drew direct inspiration from the trumpet-heavy arrangements of the Rio Bravo score. This musical DNA from Rio Bravo became a foundational element of the spaghetti western sound, with Morricone's distinctive trumpet themes in films like A Fistful of Dollars and The Good, The Bad and the Ugly, owing a creative debt to Tiomkin's original work on Hawks' film. Fact 9. Ward Bond's death by double. Ward Bond's character Pat Wheeler meets his end in Rio Bravo through one of the most cleverly disguised substitutions in film history, with the veteran actor's death scene filmed entirely using a body double shot from a distance. This unusual filming technique became necessary because Bond had already departed the old Tucson location to return to his television commitments on the popular Western series Wagon Train, where he played the lead role of Major Seth Adams. Bond's dual career as both a movie star and television leading man created a scheduling conflict that forced director Howard Hawks to find a creative solution for completing the character's storyline. The death of Pat Wheeler was essential to the plot of Rio Bravo, as it serves as a crucial turning point that escalates the tension between Sheriff Chance and the Burdett gang, but Bond's television obligations meant he could not remain on set long enough to film his character's demise. Hawks solved this problem by carefully choreographing the death scene so that it could be shot entirely from long distances and obscured angles, allowing a stand-in to substitute for Bond without the audience being able to detect the switch. The scene was filmed with the double positioned far enough away from the camera that his face and specific physical characteristics could not be clearly identified, while strategic use of shadows and camera positioning helped maintain the illusion. This scheduling conflict represented the changing nature of the entertainment industry in the late 1950s, when television was beginning to compete seriously with movies for both audience attention and actor availability. Bond was one of the first major movie stars to successfully transition into television with Wagon Train. But this career move created practical challenges for film productions that had been planned before his television commitments were finalized. The seamless nature of this substitution demonstrates Hawks' skill as a director and his ability to adapt to unexpected production challenges without compromising the quality or continuity of the finished film. Fact 10. Wayne's age gap anxiety. John Wayne experienced genuine nervousness about filming the romantic scenes with Angie Dickinson in Rio Bravo, not because of any lack of acting experience, but because he was acutely aware of the 25-year age difference between himself and his leading lady. At 51 years old, Wayne felt self-conscious about playing the love interest opposite Dickinson, who was only 26 and representing a new generation of Hollywood actresses. This anxiety was unusual for Wayne, who had built his career on projecting confidence and masculine authority in every role he played, but the romantic elements of Rio Bravo required a different kind of vulnerability that made him question whether audiences would find the pairing believable. The Duke was concerned that the significant age gap might make the romantic subplot seem forced or inappropriate, particularly given the changing social attitudes of the late 1950s. Wayne's worries were compounded by the fact that Dickinson was not only much younger, but also represented a more modern, sophisticated type of woman than the traditional frontier wives and saloon girls who had typically appeared opposite him in previous westerns. Her character, Feathers, was written as an intelligent, independent woman who could match wits with Wayne's Sheriff Chance, requiring a more nuanced romantic chemistry than the straightforward courtship scenes Wayne was accustomed to performing. Despite his initial concerns, Wayne's professionalism and Dickinson's natural charisma helped create one of the most memorable romantic pairings in Western cinema. Dickinson later credited Wayne with being supportive and encouraging during their scenes together, suggesting that his nervousness may have actually helped him deliver a more genuine and less theatrical performance than he might have given if he had felt completely confident. The romantic subplot between Chance and Feathers became one of the film's most praised elements, with critics noting the surprisingly warm chemistry between the two actors despite their age difference and different acting styles. Fact 11. The Last Hat Standing. Rio Bravo marked the end of an era for John Wayne's most recognizable costume piece, as this film was the final time he wore the iconic hat that had been part of his screen persona for 20 years. Wayne had first donned this particular hat in 1939 for John Ford's Stagecoach, the breakthrough film that transformed him from a B-movie actor into a major Hollywood star, and he had continued wearing the same piece of headwear in Western after Western throughout the 1940s and 50s. This weathered hat had become so closely associated with Wayne's screen image that it was almost like a trademark, helping audiences instantly recognize the Duke even in silhouette or from great distances. The hat had appeared in dozens of films and had become as much a part of Wayne's character as his distinctive walk or his gravelly voice, representing the continuity of his Western hero persona across multiple decades and different studios. The decision to retire the hat after Rio Bravo was likely influenced by both practical and symbolic considerations. After 20 years of use in various film productions, the hat had undoubtedly suffered considerable wear and tear from exposure to weather, stunts, and the general rigors of filmmaking. Additionally, Wayne may have felt that the late 1950s represented an appropriate time to refresh his image and costume choices as Western films began evolving to meet changing audience expectations. The hat's retirement also coincided with Wayne's growing status as an elder statesman of the Western genre, suggesting that he may have wanted to make subtle changes to his appearance that would reflect his character's maturity and experience. In his subsequent films, Wayne would wear different hats that maintained his distinctive Western look while representing a new chapter in his career. This costume change represented more than just a wardrobe decision, symbolizing the end of one phase of Wayne's career and the beginning of another as he moved into the 1960s. Fact 12. Recycled musical themes. One of the most memorable musical moments in Rio Bravo contains a hidden connection to Howard Hawks' previous collaboration with John Wayne, as the beloved song My Rifle, My Pony and Me actually recycled the exact same melody that Dmitri Tiomkin had composed 11 years earlier for their 1948 Western Red River. The only difference between the two versions was that lyricist Paul Francis Webster wrote completely new words for the Rio Bravo version, transforming what had originally been an instrumental theme into a vocal showcase for Dean Martin and Ricky Nelson. This musical recycling represented more than just a cost-saving measure or lack of creativity on Tiomkin's part, but rather served as a deliberate inside joke for fans who had followed Hawks' career closely enough to recognize the familiar melody. The composer and director were essentially creating a musical Easter egg that would reward attentive viewers who had seen both films while remaining completely invisible to casual audiences who might not have noticed the connection. The original version of this melody in Red River had been titled Settle Down, and served as a recurring instrumental theme throughout that film's cattle drive narrative. By the time Hawks decided to reuse the tune for Rio Bravo, enough time had passed that the melody felt fresh to most viewers, while the new lyrics gave it a completely different emotional context and purpose within the story. The decision to transform an instrumental piece into a vocal number also reflected the changing nature of Rio Bravo's production, which specifically incorporated musical performances to take advantage of Dean Martin and Ricky Nelson's singing abilities. This approach allowed Hawks to honor his previous work while adapting it to serve the different storytelling needs of his new film. The Western Writers of America later recognized My Rifle, My Pony and Me as one of the top 100 Western songs of all time, suggesting that the recycled melody found new life and achieved even greater recognition in its Rio Bravo incarnation than it had in its original form. Fact 13. The Anti-High Noon Statement. Rio Bravo was deliberately conceived as a direct ideological response to the 1952 Western High Noon, which Howard Hawks and John Wayne viewed as fundamentally un-American in its portrayal of a lawman desperately seeking help from cowardly townspeople. Wayne was particularly offended by Gary Cooper's character Will Kane, who spends most of high noon running around town begging reluctant citizens to assist him in facing a gang of returning outlaws, behavior that Wayne considered unbefitting of a true American hero. The political undertones of High Noon, which many interpreted as an allegory criticizing Hollywood's cooperation with McCarthyist blacklisting during the 1950s, further angered Wayne and Hawks, who held strongly conservative political views. Wayne later publicly called High Noon un-American and admitted that he did not regret his role in helping to drive the film's screenwriter, Carl Foreman, out of the country due to Foreman's alleged communist sympathies. Hawks and Wayne specifically designed Rio Bravo to present their alternative vision of how a real American lawman should behave when facing overwhelming odds. Instead of begging for assistance like Cooper's character, John Wayne's Sheriff Chance repeatedly refuses offers of help from townspeople, insisting that he only wants aid from people who are truly capable of handling themselves in a gunfight. This philosophical difference extended to every aspect of Rio Bravo's storytelling approach, with Hawks deliberately creating a narrative where help comes naturally to the sheriff from loyal friends and allies, rather than through desperate pleas to reluctant civilians. The film presents a world where good people instinctively rally around a principled leader without being asked, reflecting Hawks and Wayne's belief in traditional American values of self-reliance and voluntary cooperation. The success of Rio Bravo at the box office and with critics provided Hawks and Wayne with validation that audiences preferred their vision of heroic behavior over what they saw as the defeatist message of High Noon. Fact 14. Ricky's magical hair growth. One of the most noticeable continuity errors in Rio Bravo occurs during the film's climactic shootout sequence, when Ricky Nelson's sideburns undergo a dramatic and impossible transformation that defies the laws of biology. During the scene where Nelson's character Colorado tells Angie Dickinson's feathers to throw a flower pot through the window to distract the gunman threatening John Wayne, Nelson appears to have received a significant haircut between camera setups, with his sideburns suddenly reduced to half their previous length. This jarring visual inconsistency becomes even more obvious, because Nelson's distinctive sideburns had been a prominent part of his character's appearance throughout the entire film, contributing to his image as a young, fashionable gunslinger who represented the newer generation of Western heroes. The sudden reduction in his sideburn length creates a startling visual disconnect that sharp-eyed viewers have been spotting for decades. The mystery deepens when Nelson's sideburns magically return to their full length in subsequent scenes, suggesting that the shortened sideburns were only visible during a specific portion of the filming that was completed on a different day or after some kind of grooming mishap. This type of continuity error was relatively common in Hollywood productions of the 1950s, when film schedules often required scenes to be shot out of sequence over periods of weeks or months. The sideburn discrepancy likely resulted from either an overzealous makeup artist who trimmed Nelson's facial hair without considering continuity requirements, or from reshoots that were completed after Nelson had visited a barber for personal reasons. Given that Nelson was still a teenager during production and may not have had complete control over his grooming schedule, it's possible that the haircut was imposed by his management or parents without regard for the film's continuity needs. This type of obvious continuity mistake serves as a reminder of the practical challenges faced by film productions before modern digital editing techniques made such errors easier to correct in post-production. Fact 15. $100,000 town construction. Warner Brothers Studios invested at least $100,000, which would be equivalent to nearly $1 million in today's money, to construct additional buildings and set pieces at Old Tucson Studios specifically for Rio Bravo. This massive expenditure represented one of the largest single investments in Western movie set construction during the 1950s and demonstrated the studio's confidence in Howard Hawks' vision for the film. The construction project required the transportation of nearly 100 skilled carpenters and craftsmen from Warner Brothers' home base in Burbank, California, to the remote Arizona desert location. These workers had to travel hundreds of miles and work in the challenging conditions of the Sonoran Desert during the summer of 1958, when temperatures regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit and the isolated location made logistics extremely complicated. The carpenters were tasked with expanding what had originally been a relatively small movie set built for the 1940 film Arizona into a much larger and more elaborate frontier town. The new construction included a saloon, bank building, doctor's office, hotel, and numerous other structures that would serve as the backdrop for Rio Bravo's extended siege storyline which required multiple buildings and realistic street layouts to accommodate the complex action sequences Hawks had planned. This investment in set construction was particularly significant because Old Tucson had been essentially dormant as a movie location for several years before Rio Bravo brought it back to prominence. The Warner Brothers construction project essentially revitalized the entire facility and established it as a major filmmaking destination that would be used for dozens of subsequent Western productions throughout the 1960s, 70s. The elaborate sets built for Rio Bravo remained standing for years after the film's completion, serving as locations for other movies, and eventually becoming part of the Old Tucson theme park that opened to the public in 1960, allowing tourists to walk through the same streets where John Wayne had faced down the Burdett gang.